March 1972. American ground troops were leaving Vietnam, and the South Vietnamese Army was supposed to stand alone. But the war was about to change. North Vietnam launched a massive, coordinated invasion, not with guerrillas, but with tanks, artillery, and full divisions. Today, we explore the East Offensive, a desperate, conventional gamble to collapse South Vietnam across 3 fronts. This was the ultimate test of Vietnamization, where the fate of a nation hung on the firepower of the South Vietnamese Army, backed by the thunderous might of the US Air Force. This is the war's final, brutal surge. This is the Easter Offensive. On March 30th, 1972, Good Friday, the longest day of the Vietnam War began. Across 3 widely separated fronts, over 200,000 North Vietnamese troops poured across the borders of South Vietnam. They came not as guerrillas melting through the jungle, but as a conventional army, 14 divisions supported by Soviet T-54 and T-55 tanks, 130mm artillery, and anti-aircraft missiles. It was the largest military offensive since the Tet attacks of 1968, and the most conventional operation the North Vietnamese had ever attempted. They were betting everything, that they could overwhelm the South Vietnamese Army, collapse the Saigon government, and win the war before American air power could respond. The offensive would fail, but barely. And in its failure, it would reveal the war's essential truth, that South Vietnam could survive only with massive, sustained American support that was rapidly disappearing. This is the story of the Easter Offensive, known to the North Vietnamese as the Nguyen Hue Offensive, a 4-month battle that tested Vietnamization, revealed the limits of South Vietnamese independence, and set the stage for the war's final, tragic chapter. To understand the Easter Offensive, we must first understand what had changed by 1972. President Richard Nixon, elected in 1968 on a promise to end American involvement in Vietnam, had been implementing Vietnamization for 3 years. The policy was simple in concept: gradually withdraw US combat troops while building up South Vietnamese forces to defend their own country. And the withdrawal was dramatic. At the peak in 1969, over 543,000 American troops were in Vietnam. By early 1972, that number had dropped to fewer than 95,000, and most of those were support personnel, advisors, and air crews. American ground combat units were largely gone. The ARVN, the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, had been expanded and modernized. They now fielded over 1 million soldiers, equipped with American M16 rifles, M48 tanks, M113 armored personnel carriers, and artillery. On paper, they were a formidable force. But they had never faced a conventional invasion without massive American ground support. In Hanoi, the North Vietnamese leadership saw an opportunity. The Americans were leaving. The ARVN was untested. And crucially, American domestic opposition to the war meant Nixon was politically constrained. He could not send ground troops back to Vietnam without triggering a political crisis. The North Vietnamese plan was audacious and desperate. They would abandon their traditional guerrilla tactics and launch a multi-front conventional invasion, using their newly modernized, Soviet-equipped army to smash through ARVN defenses, seize provincial capitals, and deliver a knockout blow before the Americans could respond effectively. The operation was codenamed the Nguyen Hue Offensive, after a Vietnamese emperor who had defeated Chinese invaders in the 18th century. The plan called for simultaneous attacks across 3 separate fronts, hundreds of miles apart, designed to overwhelm ARVN forces and prevent them from reinforcing each other. Front 1, the North, Quang Tri Province. PAVN forces would pour across the Demilitarized Zone, DMZ, and through Laos, overwhelming the ARVN 3rd Division and seizing the provincial capital. Front 2, the Central Highlands, Kontum Province. PAVN forces would attack from Cambodia, threatening to cut South Vietnam in half. Front 3, the South, Bin Long Province. PAVN forces would strike towards Saigon itself, threatening the capital and the psychological heart of South Vietnam. The scale was unprecedented. The North Vietnamese committed nearly their entire regular army, 14 divisions totaling over 200,000 troops. They brought hundreds of Soviet-supplied tanks, T-54s, T-55s, and PT-76 light tanks. They deployed massive 130mm field guns capable of outranging most ARVN artillery. They equipped their forces with SA-7 Strealer shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missiles to counter helicopters and low-flying aircraft. This was not guerrilla warfare. This was conventional, mechanized warfare, the kind the Soviet Union had perfected in World War II. Tanks would lead breakthrough assaults. Artillery would pulverize defensive positions. Infantry would follow and consolidate. The strategic goals were ambitious. First, overwhelm the ARVN and demonstrate that Vietnamization had failed, that South Vietnam could not stand without American ground troops. Second, seize major cities and provincial capitals, establishing facts on the ground that would strengthen North Vietnam's position at the Paris peace talks, which had been stalled for years. Third, ideally, trigger the collapse of the South Vietnamese government and end the war in a decisive victory. On March 30, 1972, Good Friday, with many ARVN soldiers on leave for the Easter holiday, the offensive began. And South Vietnam, for the first time since Tet, faced an existential threat. Front 1, the North, Quang Tri Province. The Northern Front erupted first. At dawn on March 30th, over 30,000 PAVN troops from the 304th, 308th, and 324B divisions, supported by 200 tanks and heavy artillery, attacked across the DMZ and from staging areas in Laos. The target was Quang Tri Province, the northernmost province of South Vietnam, defended by the ARVN 3rd Division. The 3rd Division was spread thin, manning a string of isolated phi bases along the DMZ. They were positioned to defend against infiltration, not repel a conventional armored assault. The PAVN artillery barrage was devastating. Thousands of shells from 130mm guns rained down on ARVN positions, destroying bunkers, cutting communications, and terrorizing defenders who had never experienced such concentrated firepower. Then the tanks came, T-54s crashing through defensive lines, crushing barbed wire, firing point-blank into bunkers. The ARVN 3rd Division fought bravely but was quickly overwhelmed. Individual phi base garrisons held out heroically, Phi Base Charlie, Phi Base Alpha, Camp Carroll, but without armor, without sufficient anti-tank weapons, they could not stop the mechanized assault. By April 2nd, Camp Carroll, a major artillery phi base, surrendered, its commander apparently losing his nerve. The fall of Camp Carroll was a psychological blow and opened the road to Quang Tri City, the provincial capital. ARVN forces retreated south in growing disorder. On May 1st, after a month of fighting, Quang Tri City fell to PAVN forces. The defenders, civilians and soldiers, fled south on Highway 1 in a chaotic exodus that became known as the Highway of Terror. Refugees streamed south, families carrying possessions, wounded soldiers, abandoned vehicles clogging the road. PAVN artillery targeted the highway, turning it into a killing ground. Thousands died, civilians and soldiers mixed together in the panic. The fall of Quang Tri was the worst ARVN defeat of the war to that point. An entire province had been lost. The psychological impact was devastating. But the PAVN advance stalled at the Mai Chan River, just north of Hue. ARVN forces, reinforced and backed by intensive US airstrikes, finally stabilized a defensive line. The northern front had held, barely. While the north burned, another front exploded in the Central Highlands. On April 2nd, the PAVN 320th Division, reinforced by tanks and heavy artillery, attacked from Cambodia toward Kontum City, a strategic highland town that controlled the approaches to the coast. If Kontum fell, the PAVN could drive east, cutting Highway 19 and effectively splitting South Vietnam in half, isolating the northern provinces from Saigon and the Mekong Delta. The defenders were primarily ARVN 23rd Division troops and Ranger battalions, along with local militia. They were outnumbered but determined. The city became a fortress. Bunkers, trenches, minefields ringed the perimeter. The PAVN siege began in late April. Artillery pounded the city daily. Tanks probed the defenses. Infantry assaults came in waves. The fighting was desperate, often hand-to-hand when PAVN troops breached the perimeter. American advisors, men like John Paul Vann, the legendary senior advisor in the Central Highlands, coordinated the defense, calling in massive airstrikes to break up PAVN assaults. B-52 arc-light strikes carpeted the approaches to the city. Tactical fighters dropped napalm and cluster bombs on tank columns. By late May, after nearly 2 months of siege, the PAVN attacks began to falter. The combination of determined ARVN resistance and overwhelming US air power had held. Kontum did not fall. But it had been close. Terrifyingly close. Front 3, the South, and LOC. The most critical front, the one that threatened the very existence of South Vietnam, was the southern offensive toward Saigon. On April 5th, the PAVN 5th and 7th Divisions, supported by the 9th Division and reinforced with tanks and artillery, attacked from Cambodia toward the provincial capital of an LOC, a town sitting astride Highway 13, the main route from the Cambodian border to Saigon, just 65 miles to the south. An LOC was defended by the ARVN 5th Division and elements of the Airborne Division, among the best units in the ARVN. If an LOC fell, the road to Saigon would be open. The fall of the capital would mean the end of South Vietnam. The siege of an LOC became one of the most intense battles of the entire war. PAVN forces surrounded the town, cutting it off from ground resupply. Everything, ammunition, food, water, medical supplies, had to be delivered by air, parachuted into the besieged garrison. The PAVN bombarded the town relentlessly. Artillery fire was continuous, thousands of shells per day. Tanks attacked the perimeter in coordinated assaults. Infantry waves tried to overwhelm the defenses. The ARVN defenders fought with extraordinary courage. They repelled assault after assault. They used American-supplied M72 Law anti-tank weapons to destroy T-54 tanks at close range. They held their positions even when ammunition ran low, even when casualties mounted, even when it seemed impossible to hold any longer. American advisors, trapped in the town, called in airstrikes danger close. B-52 strikes within 1,000 meters of their own positions, the closest employment of strategic bombers in the war. The earth shook. Buildings collapsed. But the PAVN assaults broke. The siege of an LOC lasted 95 days, from early April through mid-June. When it finally ended, the town was a ruin, 60% of the buildings destroyed, the landscape cratered, the streets littered with destroyed tanks and bodies. But an LOC had held. And with it, South Vietnam survived. Across all 3 fronts, the pattern was the same. Initial PAVN success through overwhelming conventional firepower, ARVN forces retreating or holding desperately, and then, critically, the intervention of American air power. Because President Nixon had made a decision. The ARVN would not face this invasion alone. And the weapon he would use was the same one that had failed at Rolling Thunder but would prove decisive now: air power, used without political constraint. Operation Linebacker was about to begin. As the Easter offensive unfolded, President Richard Nixon faced a critical decision. American ground troops were gone. The policy of Vietnamization had staked everything on the ARVN's ability to defend South Vietnam independently. And now that independence was being tested by the largest conventional invasion of the war, Nixon's options were limited. He could not send ground troops back. Domestic opposition made that politically impossible. He could abandon South Vietnam, but that would mean surrendering to a communist invasion and betraying years of American sacrifice. Or he could use air power, massively, decisively, and without the political constraints that had crippled Operation Rolling Thunder years earlier. Nixon chose air power, but this time it would be different. This would not be graduated response, carefully calibrated strikes on limited targets. This would be overwhelming force, B-52 strategic bombers, tactical fighter bombers, naval air power, all unleashed simultaneously to destroy PAVN forces wherever they concentrated. The operation was codenamed Linebacker, a direct, aggressive name that reflected its mission: hit the enemy hard, break their offensive, and force them to the negotiating table. The centerpiece of Linebacker was the B-52 Stratofortress. These massive bombers, designed to deliver nuclear weapons on Soviet cities, had been used in Vietnam since 1965, but never with such intensity and precision. B-52s flew arc light strikes, formations of 3 bombers dropping their entire payload simultaneously from 30,000 feet, creating rolling waves of explosions that obliterated everything in a grid square. Each bomber carried up to 108 500-pound bombs or 84 750-pound bombs. The attacks were devastating. But during the Easter Offensive, the B-52s were employed differently. Instead of carpet bombing suspected infiltration routes in the jungle, they were used for close air support, hitting PAVN troop concentrations, tank columns, and artillery positions within kilometers of ARVN defensive lines. This was unprecedented. Strategic bombers had never been used as tactical close air support weapons on this scale. At an LOC, B-52 strikes broke PAVN assaults before they could reach ARVN lines. Entire regiments, thousands of troops advancing in the open, were caught by arc light strikes and obliterated. Tank columns were destroyed. Artillery positions were silenced. American advisors on the ground described the effect as apocalyptic: the earth trembling, the horizon erupting in flames, the enemy simply disappearing. At Kontum, B-52 strikes turned the approaches to the city into a moonscape. PAVN forces trying to concentrate for assaults were hit repeatedly, day and night. The siege could not be sustained under such punishment. At Quang Tri, once the defensive line stabilized, B-52s pounded PAVN positions relentlessly, preventing them from advancing further south toward Hue. Supporting the B-52s were hundreds of tactical fighter bombers, F-4 Phantoms, A-7 Corsairs, A-6 Intruders. They flew close air support missions in direct coordination with ARVN ground forces and American advisors. The fighters dropped laser-guided bombs, smart bombs that could hit individual bunkers, bridges, and tanks with unprecedented precision. They used cluster bombs to destroy PAVN infantry in the open. They dropped napalm to clear fortified positions. Attack helicopters, AH-1 Cobra gunships, provided direct fire support to ARVN troops, using rockets and miniguns to destroy tanks and suppress enemy positions. The Cobras were particularly effective against PAVN armor, attacking tanks from above where their armor was thinnest. But Linebacker was not limited to South Vietnam. For the first time since the 1968 bombing halt, Nixon authorized strikes on North Vietnam itself, and this time without the restrictions that had hampered Rolling Thunder. On May 8, 1972, Nixon announced a dramatic escalation: the mining of Haiphong Harbor, North Vietnam's primary port, and intensive bombing of rail lines, bridges, and supply depots throughout the north. U.S. Navy aircraft dropped magnetic and acoustic mines in the harbor approaches, effectively blockading North Vietnam from Soviet resupply ships. For the first time, the flow of weapons and supplies from the USSR was cut, something Rolling Thunder had failed to achieve. B-52s struck targets in North Vietnam, including areas near Hanoi and Haiphong that had been off-limits for years. The Paul Duma Bridge in Hanoi was destroyed again, this time with precision-guided munitions. Rail yards were obliterated. Oil storage facilities burned. The impact on the battlefield in South Vietnam was immediate. PAVN forces, already suffering massive casualties from US airstrikes, began running short of ammunition, fuel, and supplies. Their offensive momentum stalled. Their ability to sustain the invasion collapsed. But air power alone did not save South Vietnam. The ARVN had to hold, and in critical battles, they did. At an LOC, ARVN paratroopers and the 5th Division fought with extraordinary courage, repelling assaults even when surrounded and under constant bombardment. At Kontum, ARVN Rangers held the perimeter against overwhelming odds, buying time for air power to break the siege. At Quang Tri, while the initial defense collapsed, ARVN forces stabilized and eventually counterattacked. The Easter Offensive had revealed a critical truth about Vietnamization. The ARVN could fight effectively, but only with massive US air support. Without American B-52s, tactical aircraft, and advisors, South Vietnam would have fallen in 1972. The question was, what would happen when that support was gone? By July 1972, the Easter Offensive had stalled. PAVN forces had taken enormous casualties. Estimates ranged from 40,000 to 100,000 killed and wounded, and their supply lines, cut by American bombing and the Haiphong blockade, could no longer sustain offensive operations. But they had not been defeated. They held significant territory: Quang Tri Province in the north, positions in the Central Highlands, and areas around an LOC. And they were digging in, fortifying their gains, preparing to defend what they had taken. For South Vietnam, holding was not enough. The lost territory, especially Quang Tri City, the only provincial capital the PAVN had captured, was a psychological wound and a propaganda victory for the North. It had to be retaken. In June 1972, the ARVN launched Operation Lam Son 72, a counteroffensive to retake Quang Tri Province. The operation was led by the Marine Division and the reconstituted 1st Division, supported by airborne units and ranger battalions. The advance was slow and brutal. The PAVN had turned Quang Tri City into a fortress. Bunkers, trenches, minefields, artillery positions ringed the city. They were determined to hold it. ARVN forces advanced under continuous air support. B-52 strikes pounded PAVN positions ahead of the advance. Tactical aircraft provided close support. Naval gunfire from US destroyers offshore hammered defensive lines. The fighting was intense. ARVN Marines fought building by building through the ruins of Quang Tri. PAVN defenders contested every street, every house. The city had already been devastated during the initial invasion. Now it was being destroyed again in the effort to retake it. On September 16, 1972, 169 days after it had fallen, Quang Tri City was recaptured. ARVN Marines raised the South Vietnamese flag over the citadel. The victory was symbolic, proof that the ARVN could counterattack and retake lost ground. But the cost had been staggering. The city was a ruin. The province was devastated, and the victory had required continuous, massive American air support. By October 1972, the Easter Offensive was over. Fighting continued sporadically, but the major offensives had ended. Both sides assessed the results. The North Vietnamese had failed to achieve their primary objectives. They had not collapsed the South Vietnamese government. They had not sparked a general uprising. They had not captured Saigon or any other major city except Quang Tri, which they later lost. But they had inflicted heavy casualties, over 10,000 ARVN troops killed, tens of thousands wounded. They had demonstrated the ARVN's dependence on American support. And they had retained some territorial gains that would strengthen their position at the peace talks. The South Vietnamese and Americans had stopped the invasion. The ARVN had held at critical points, an LOC, Kontum, the line north of Hue. They had counterattacked and retaken lost ground. Vietnamization had survived its greatest test. But the cost revealed the policy's fundamental flaw. South Vietnam could defend itself only with massive, sustained American air support, the kind of support that required thousands of US airmen, billions of dollars, and political will that was rapidly evaporating. The Easter Offensive directly influenced the Paris Peace Accords signed in January 1973. Both sides, battered and exhausted, had incentive to negotiate. North Vietnam had proven it could launch massive offensives but could not win decisively. The US had proven it could support South Vietnam, but only through air power and only at unsustainable cost. The agreement signed in Paris allowed North Vietnamese troops to remain in South Vietnam, a critical concession that essentially guaranteed the war would continue. But it allowed Nixon to declare peace with honor and withdraw the remaining US forces. When the North launched its final offensive in 1975, the result would be different. There would be no American air support, no B-52 strikes, no resupply. The ARVN would fight alone and would fall in 55 days. The Easter Offensive had demonstrated what South Vietnam could achieve with American support. And by extension, it demonstrated what would happen without it. The Easter Offensive ultimately failed to achieve its main goals. The ARVN, with critical US air support, Operation Linebacker, proved resilient, holding crucial cities like an LOC and Kontum and recapturing Quang Tri. The cost to North Vietnam was immense, with an estimated 100,000 casualties and thousands of tanks destroyed. The invasion was a tactical failure, but the PAVN did seize and hold significant territory, shifting the political balance of power. The campaign confirmed a harsh lesson for both sides. The South could only survive with massive American air backing, and the North could inflict devastating damage whenever they chose to escalate the conflict. These realities were carried directly to the negotiating table, sealing the terms of the 1973 Paris Peace Accords. If you want to understand the monumental struggles where the balance of power shifts between ground warfare and air superiority, make sure you subscribe to History of Conflicts. Hit that notification bell and leave a comment below. We want to know, was Operation Linebacker the single most decisive factor in preventing the collapse of South Vietnam during the Easter Offensive? Thanks for watching.